There is a conversation happening inside your head right now. Not a vague feeling, not background noise. An actual conversation, with words, with tone, with something that sounds unmistakably like you. But here's what almost nobody asks. What kind of conversation is it? And what does the shape of that conversation say about the shape of your mind? For most people, inner dialogue feels so natural that it barely registers as something worth examining. It's just thinking, it is just you. But researchers who have spent decades studying what actually happens inside human minds have found something quietly astonishing. The way people experience their inner voice varies far more than most of us have ever assumed. Some people narrate their lives in full sentences. Some think in images with no words at all. Some experience a chorus of competing voices. Some hear almost nothing. And for people whose minds are wired differently, including those living with the combination of autism and ADHD, sometimes called AuDHD, the inner world can be something else entirely, something harder to name. Something that the standard conversation about inner speech has mostly ignored. This is a video about what goes on inside your head. Not the content of your thoughts, but the structure of them, the form your inner life actually takes, and why understanding that structure might be one of the most honest and useful things you can do for yourself. The modern idea of inner speech has a surprisingly specific origin. The Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky proposed in the early 20th century that the voice inside your head is not something you're born with, it develops. As children, we speak our thoughts out loud. Over time, that external speech turns inward. It becomes abbreviated, compressed, personal. The inner voice is, in this sense, language that has been folded back on itself. The British psychologist Charles Fernyhough built on this in his research on the dialogic mind. He argued that inner speech is not a monologue, it is a dialogue. Even when you appear to be thinking alone, you are often thinking in relation to others, to imagined listeners, to remembered voices, to earlier versions of yourself. The inner conversation is shaped by every real conversation you have ever had. Russell Hurlburt, a psychologist at the University of Nevada, spent decades using a method called descriptive experience sampling to study inner experience in real time. He would ask participants to wear an earpiece that beeped at random intervals throughout the day. When the beep sounded, they had to describe exactly what was happening in their awareness at that precise moment. What he found challenged almost every assumption researchers had made. Inner speech, words or sentences in the mind, was present in roughly a quarter of moments, not the majority. Many people experience their thoughts primarily as images, feelings, or unsymbolized knowing, a sense of something without any verbal form at all. This matters because most theories of inner dialogue have assumed that thinking means talking to yourself, but thinking for many people does not work that way. Inner speech researchers have identified several distinct modes of internal conversation. There's the evaluative inner voice, the one that judges your performance, replays a difficult interaction, assesses whether you said the right thing. There's the motivational voice, the one that coaches you through a task, sets intentions, talks you into or out of a decision. There's the narrative voice, the one that tells the story of your life to yourself, that constructs meaning from events, that connects the past to the present. And there's the relational voice, the one that rehearses conversations, anticipates reactions, models other people's responses before they happen. These types are not rigid categories. Most people move between them constantly, but research suggests that the balance between them, which voice dominates, how loud it is, how kind or hostile its tone, varies significantly between individuals, and that variation is not random. It tracks psychological experience in ways that are beginning to look deeply meaningful. In people experiencing depression, the evaluative inner voice frequently becomes dominant, repetitive, and hostile. The psychologist Ethan Kross, whose research on what he calls the inner critic has been widely replicated, found that rumination, the tendency to replay and rehearse negative events in self-directed language, is one of the strongest predictors of depressive episodes. The content of what is being said matters, but so does the relentless loop itself. In anxiety, the anticipatory voice, the one modeling threats and imagining worst-case futures, tends to become hyperactive. The inner dialogue becomes a risk assessment engine that cannot switch off. In OCD, unwanted intrusive thoughts arrive as an inner voice the person experiences as alien to their own identity, thoughts they cannot claim as theirs, which is part of what makes the experience so distressing. Each of these represents not just a change in mood, but a change in the structure of inner conversation. Now, consider what happens when you combine autism and ADHD. These two neurodevelopmental conditions are distinct but frequently co-occurring. Conservative estimates suggest that somewhere between 50 and 70% of autistic people also meet the criteria for ADHD, and similar overlap exists in the other direction. For a long time, they were treated as mutually exclusive in diagnostic frameworks. You could not officially be diagnosed with both. That has changed, and the clinical and research communities are now beginning to understand AuDHD as its own profile, rather than simply the sum of two diagnoses. Autism, broadly speaking, involves differences in social processing, sensory experience, pattern recognition, and cognitive style. Many autistic people describe highly systematic inner worlds, detailed, precise, rule-governed thinking. Some report extremely rich verbal inner speech. Others report thinking entirely in images, spatial patterns, or what is sometimes described as pure logic without language. Temple Grandin, the autistic professor and author, has written extensively about her visual thinking, a form of inner experience in which concepts appear as three-dimensional images rather than words. She has described having to consciously translate her thinking into language for others. ADHD, on the other hand, involves differences in executive function, attention regulation, and impulse control. The inner dialogue of someone with ADHD is often described as fragmented, fast-moving, and difficult to direct. Thoughts interrupt each other. Attention shifts before a sentence finishes. The motivational inner voice, the one needed to begin and sustain a task, may be present in intention but absent in practice. Some researchers, including Russell Barkley, have argued that ADHD fundamentally affects the internalization of speech, the very process Vygotsky described. The inner voice in ADHD may be less reliably available as a tool for self-regulation than it is for neurotypical people. Put these two profiles together, and something genuinely complicated emerges. The AuDHD inner world can contain deeply systematic, detail-focused internal monologues and simultaneously be unable to sustain attention on them long enough to act. It can involve extraordinary sensitivity to social nuance, processed through endless internal rehearsal and replay of conversations, and simultaneously struggle to filter which social signals actually deserve that level of processing. The evaluative inner voice may be both highly articulate and relentlessly critical, fueled not just by ADHD rejection-sensitive dysphoria, the intense emotional response to perceived failure or disapproval, but also by decades of social feedback that something about how the person engages with the world is wrong, without ever being told clearly what. Masking adds another layer. Many autistic people and many AuDHD people develop a sophisticated internal performance of neurotypicality. There is an outer self constructed to pass, and there is the inner voice running the performance, monitoring every word before it leaves the mouth, analyzing every interaction after it ends. This creates a particular kind of inner dialogue that is exhausting in ways that are difficult to explain from the outside. The continuous background process of translating who you are into something that feels safe to show. Rejection-sensitive dysphoria, a term associated with ADHD, but perhaps especially intense in AuDHD, produces its own distinctive inner conversation. A perceived slight, a short reply, a canceled plan can trigger an inner monologue of extraordinary emotional speed and intensity. The evaluative voice turns catastrophic within seconds. What began as a neutral event becomes evidence of a deeper unworthiness that had always been suspected. The voice is fast, total, and temporarily impossible to argue with. And then there is the hyperfocus monologue, the inner voice state that arrives when attention locks on to something that genuinely interests the AuDHD mind. The inner voice becomes singular, immersive, almost euphoric in its focus. Every other channel goes quiet. For a few hours, the fragmentation disappears, the self-monitoring recedes, and the mind operates with an ease that stands in sharp contrast to everything else. It is often the closest an AuDHD person gets to inner quiet, and it is triggered not by calm, but by genuine interest. What the research on inner speech suggests, and what the phenomenology of AuDHD illustrates particularly clearly, is that the inner voice is not a passive observer of your mental life. It is an active participant in it. The way it speaks to you, the type of conversation it defaults to, the emotional tone it uses, all shape how you experience yourself and the world in real time. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger has written about the self as a model, a construction the brain generates moment by moment to make sense of its own processes. The inner voice is one of the primary tools that model uses to maintain itself. When the voice is hostile, the model of the self becomes hostile. When the voice is fragmented, the model of the self becomes uncertain. When the voice runs a continuous performance script, the model of the self becomes the performance. This is not an argument that inner dialogue determines identity. It is an argument that paying attention to it is worth doing. There are practical ways to begin, noticing without judgment what mode your inner voice tends to default to. Is it evaluative? Is it anticipatory? Is it rehearsing? Is it narrating? Is it silent in ways you find disorienting or peaceful? For AuDHD people in particular, identifying the difference between a masking monologue and a genuine inner voice, if that distinction can be found at all, can be the beginning of understanding which thoughts are actually yours and which are borrowed scripts. Writing, for many people, externalizes the inner voice in a way that makes it easier to examine. Journaling, free writing, or simply typing without a reader in mind can slow the voice down enough to hear its structure rather than just its content. Therapy approaches that work with inner voice directly, including some forms of cognitive work and internal family systems, have shown genuine benefit for people whose evaluative voices have become loud and unkind. For neurodivergent people, the most important starting point is often simply permission. Permission to have an inner world that does not conform to a neurotypical template. Permission to think in images, or in fragments, or in parallel channels, or in relative silence, without that being evidence of something broken. The inner conversation inside your head began before you were aware there was a conversation happening. Understanding its shape does not silence it, but it does change who is listening, and that might be the most useful shift of all.